Hello again. Now, today we're going to talk about community. Community is a word you hear a lot these days. Politicians, advertisers, even college administrators spend a lot of time talking about how we are all part of a community. They usually do that when they want something. Anytime someone asks you to follow a rule you don't like, or accept a tax increase, or work overtime without getting paid for it, you can bet that they are going to remind you that we are a community, right? And that's why you should do it. My brother, who is a bit more cynical than I am, used to like to say that if the translation were honest, community would be the plural of sucker. Now, I'm not quite as cynical as he is, and I think community is a little more than that. But I do see what he means, because the notion of community implies something greater than the individual, something that's a part of you and has a claim on you, something that's different from all the individual personal relationships that you have in your life. To say that you belong to a community means that if you think about yourself just as an individual, you're missing something. And of course, if someone wants you to act in a way that seems to go against your individual interests, then your community membership is something they're going to mention. And the thing is, they're right. No matter how individual you are, no matter how isolated you feel, as a human being, you're part of some sort of community. You couldn't exist otherwise. You're connected to other people through the language you speak, through the job you work in, through the neighborhood you live in, through the networks of obligation and economics and communication that shape every minute of your reality. There used to be a saying that some people would use when they wanted to sound rugged. I don't know if it's still out there. People would say, "You're born alone and you die alone." That's nonsense. Very few people actually die alone. And I can assure you that in the history of human beings, there has never been a person who was born alone. There has to be at least one other person there for the event to take place. And for a newborn to survive, to live and thrive, to learn to talk and dress and reason, and do all the other things that even the most rugged individualist has to do, there have to be other people. Those people make up a community, and that community is always part of who you are. And indeed, some social scientists have argued that you can think of community as an almost physical thing, something that exists on its own, independent of the people in it. The great French sociologist Émile Durkheim, for example, saw society as something that was intensely real. He argued that the reason religion, for example, is so universal among human cultures is that it's a way of talking about something that really exists. Durkheim said that if you believe in something that was here before you were born and will exist after you die, something that gives meaning to life and the world, something that determines what's right and wrong and good and bad, something that's around you all the time and influences every word you say and everything you do, and you think of that as God, you're not wrong. You're just calling it by the wrong name. It's your community. All of that may or may not be true of a supernatural being, but it is definitely true of society. Durkheim argued that the reason rituals are so powerful, the reason that we feel such an energy and elevated consciousness when we're in a mass gathering, is because it's the one time that we can physically feel the presence of that society, that social fact. Now, Alfred Kroeber, one of the founders of American anthropology, put it a little differently. He argued that when we look at the kinds of things that are out there, we're making a mistake if we just look at physical things. He contended that social processes should be regarded as a different kind of real thing, one that's not visible, but which is no less powerful and no less real for all that. Kroeber argued for the existence of something he called the superorganic, a kind of thing that didn't exist in any particular physical place, but whose existence could be proved by the effect that it had on people. Society, culture, community, for Kroeber weren't just theoretical concepts, but a real thing, something that it was the job of anthropology to study. Now, when you think about this in terms of social science, one of the advantages of this approach to culture is that it allowed you to think of it as a whole. A regular organism, like an amoeba, or a tree, or a horse, is composed of lots of different parts. A horse has hooves and a mane and eyes and a bunch of internal organs and bones and all that kind of stuff. And if you want to understand any individual one of those, You do that by seeing how it contributes to the whole thing. Why does a horse have eyes? Well, so it can take information in about the world around it that will allow the whole organism to survive and thrive and ultimately reproduce. Why does it have legs? To move the whole organism around, to help it survive and thrive and ultimately reproduce. Any individual organ, or even any individual cell, can be understood in terms of how it helps the survival and the evolutionary goals of the whole organism. Now, if you think about cultures as organisms, or at least as organic wholes, you could do the same thing. You could look at any item of culture in terms of its function, what it does to contribute to the healthy operation of the whole thing, its function. Why do we have this festival or that custom or that kind of kinship? Well, just like the eyes of a horse, it contributes to the health of the whole society. Now, this way of thinking about society is especially associated with the work of English anthropologist A.R. Radcliffe Brown, who developed a model called structural functionalism that tried to place just about every custom in the context of the structure of the whole society. Radcliffe Brown argued that what cultural customs do, the reason they're there, is to get people to behave in ways that promote the stability and the survival of the group. So if you see something weird or unexpected in a society, what you need to do is to look at its social effects. No matter how crazy something may look to you, it usually produces an outcome that's good for the people doing it. Now, one example he gave of this was something called joking relationships. A lot of cultures have these. They're relationships in a family where people are expected to communicate in jokes. In some Southern African societies, for example, a man would never, ever have a serious conversation with his mother-in-law. When they interacted, it was always through some sort of teasing. If she walked into a room and he was sitting down, she might look and say, look at old lazy bones, dodging work again. And he might say, oh, no, I'm not dodging work. I'm just recovering from that awful stuff you served at dinner last night. Or you may have some relatives in your own family you interact with that way. Joking relationships. Now, Radcliffe Brown said that these customs were not just random. They almost always involved relationships that were structurally kind of tense. If the relationship between a mother-in-law and a son-in-law is generally a strained one, then by making all their conversations jokes, you can assure that any actual tension is laughed off. Now, the mother-in-law probably does, in fact, think that her son-in-law is lazy, and she gets to say so. But since it's always in the form of a joke, nobody gets mad. The cultural custom, in other words, helps everybody to get along, and in doing so, it helps the society to function. Now, you could also look at this in ecological terms. The American anthropologist Marvin Harris, for example, liked to explain customs, religious customs, in terms of their ecological function. Why is pork taboo for Jews and Muslims, for example? Well, Harris argued it's because pigs aren't good animals to raise in the desert regions where these religious groups originated. By making pork taboo, the culture kept people from making a bad decision about livestock management. Likewise, Harris asked, why are cows sacred in India? Well, according to him, it was because the religious rule kept people from slaughtering their breeding stock during tough times. If you regard society as an organism, which he was doing, you can explain any custom by looking at how it helps the organism survive. Now, this kind of approach works really well if you're looking at the cultures that anthropologists started out studying. The Trobriand Islanders of Malinowski, or Margaret Mead's Arapesh, or Ruth Benedict's Zuni. Societies like that had, or at least appeared to have, pretty clear boundaries. They were cut off from the rest of the world by water, or deserts, or mountains, or jungles. So the question of what the community was seemed pretty obvious. The community was everybody there. If you were on Samoa, you were a Samoan. And if you weren't, you weren't, right? Over time, though, anthropologists started working in other kinds of places like Southeast Asia, and the grasslands of Africa, and urban places like the United States, where it wasn't quite as clear who belonged to a group and who didn't, or where the boundaries were that separated one group from another. That made it a lot harder to talk about social groups, and especially hard to talk about culture. After all, we tend to define culture as a set of symbols and meanings that are associated with a specific group of people. But if we're not sure where the group begins and ends, how can we define what the culture is? And the closer we look at groups, the harder they often are to define. One of the best known anthropological projects of the first part of the 20th century, for example, was a series of books written by E. Evans Pritchard on the Nuer of the Southern Sudan. Wonderful books. Evans Pritchard worked with them in the field for a number of years. He wrote some books about them. Again, they're wonderful books. They're ones that are still widely read today. I assign them for some of my courses. By all accounts, he was an excellent field worker. He knew the Nuer very well, and he wrote about them with an incredible amount of sensitivity and insight. But who exactly are the Nuer? Well, according to a later analysis by Aidan Southall, there really weren't any people in the area Evans Pritchard worked who actually called themselves Nuer at the time he was there. Nuer was a term that had been around for a while, but it was actually a term that the Nuer's neighbors, the Dinka, used to refer to them. The people they called the Nuer called themselves the Na'ath. The Dinka, meanwhile, didn't call themselves the Dinka either. That was the term that the Na'ath used for them. But in fact, they distinguished themselves into a number of different local and linguistic groups, none of which they called Dinka. And this wasn't just a matter of names. There were real differences of culture among these different groups, and it would be hard to say whether they made up one single coherent culture area or not. Now, this turned out to be the case almost wherever anthropologists looked. Defining groups and their boundaries was a lot harder than earlier anthropologists thought it would be. And if you couldn't define communities clearly, how could you say anything sensible about the contributions the different customs made to them? All these functional models we were talking about assumed that there was a distinctive something called the community, or the culture, that different customs were designed to support. Without that community, what happens to all those explanations? How can you come up with a functionalist explanation of a culture that you can't exactly point out where it exists? Now, in response to this, anthropology, starting back in the 1970s, began talking less and less about tribes and clans and so on, and more about another kind of group, the ethnic group. An ethnic group refers to a group of people who see themselves as connected to one another on the basis of a shared culture and genealogy. People in an ethnic group feel that they share a common culture, ways of speaking, ways of eating, ways of believing, ways of seeing the world. They also tend to see themselves as sharing a genetic heritage, that they're all related to one another in some way. In this sense, you could talk about a tribe as an ethnic group. You could also talk about a diaspora as an ethnic group, or you could talk about Norwegian Americans, or African Americans, or Hispanic Americans as an ethnic group. Now, we're going to talk more about ethnic groups next week when we discuss race, and a little further on when we talk about modernity. All that I'd like to mention now is that this is a different model of community than the old ones that anthropologists used to use. It's much less bounded, much less settled, and one that you would be very hard to describe as a kind of organism. And that means that a lot of the ways that early anthropologists explain the meanings of culture need to be rethought. And in some cases, we may need very different kinds of explanations to make sense of community when we're thinking about it this way.